Giving an Answer, the show dedicated to defending the historic Christian faith. I am your host, H.E. Felder, and today the topic is Debunking the Mythological Roots of Christianity, the Follow-Up. And to talk with me today, I have a special guest. My special guest is Alan DiDonato. And let me tell you about Adam. Adam has a bachelor's in classics. He has a master's in classical archaeology, and he is an instructor at Central Piedmont Community College in Ancient and Medieval Humanities and Myth and Human Culture. And welcome to the show again.
Thank you for having me back, Harold. I appreciate it.
Okay, for those of you who haven't seen the first show, let me just explain what we're doing. We did a show on this topic called Debunking the Mythological Roots of Christianity, and when we ended the show, I realized that we didn't talk about a lot of stuff we were supposed to talk about. There were just a lot of things that were left hanging out there, and I didn't want to leave them hanging out there, so I invited Alan to come back on to clear up some of those issues. So thanks for coming back on, Alan, to follow up what we started before.
You're welcome.
And to just go through basically what we were talking about. The whole purpose of the show is to deal with the arguments that people make over and over again, that Christianity just basically stole from pagan religions, and it's just a religion that's just a composite of all other pagan religions. So could you rehash what you went over just briefly what we talked about last time?
It's hard to do because there's so much to cover, which is a problem that we had the first time. But the basic argument that we dealt with in brief was that the idea that there are parallels in other myths that, obviously parallel Christianity, and therefore the accusation that Christianity borrows from these pagan sources. And we basically talked about how that particular argument is a fallacious argument. We looked at it sort of, as a syllogism. The idea that parallels imply borrowing, and we basically said that that's actually backwards. The statement that if there are parallels, then there must be borrowing sort of reverses the relationship between those two statements, and it should actually be if there's borrowing, then you can have parallels. So we call that a sufficient condition for having parallels. But the fact that there are parallels is not a sufficient condition for there to be borrowing. So we can't conclude that the Bible has borrowed from pagan sources just because there's parallels. So
right. And explain what we mean by parallel.
Parallels would be any elements in the story, talking, let's say, just the Gospels in particular. There's lots of different stories in the Bible that we could sort of go through, but the Gospels are the biggest concern, obviously, for Christianity. So that there are elements in the Christian Gospels, the story of Jesus and his life, that you find in pagan myths, particularly elements, which I'll talk about a little bit later, hopefully, on like the virgin birth, the resurrection, those types of things.
Okay, so now here's something that you said on the last show that I gotta admit wasn't my favorite statement. And we were trying to define what a myth was, and you defined Christianity as being myth. Now, explain that and clean that up, please.
Yeah. I need to do that. 'Cause that's like I say, every time I give a talk on this particular topic, that is a controversial statement. You don't want to come away and think, he just said that the Bible's a myth.
Right.
Because that's the wrong impression. That's not what I'm trying to get. I was basically giving a definition of myth that I think is a more accurate definition of myth than just assuming myth is somehow just a false story. Okay? In the field of mythology, we look at things other than whether or not the story is true or false. Okay? So to take into consideration worldview, take into consideration the content of various stories and the function of various stories, you need to come up with a definition that's fairly objective. And the definition I gave was a myth is a story that acknowledges the supernatural metaphysical reality of the universe as it deals with cultural concerns and the reoccurring universal questions of humanity, and it's at least partly traditional in nature. And I think that's probably the best definition of a myth that we can come up with. But if you then look at that definition in relation to the scriptures, you're going to see that the stories in the Bible fit that definition.
Right.
So by that criteria, the stories in the Bible are myths. But what's not part of the definition, this is the part I have to emphasize the most, what's not part of the definition is historicity. So in other words, you could have a story that is myth that is not historical, and you could have a story that's a myth that is historical, because the criteria for determining whether something is historical is separate from the criteria for determining that it's myth.
Okay.
Okay. So what we want to do is be able to distinguish between pagan myths and the Christian gospel, which is historical and which is not historical. That's a different issue.
Right. Because, we did want to clear that up, because people say, because the whole point we're trying to prove here is that the Bible is true,
Right.
and that the Bible did not steal from these myths. And I just wanted to make sure we cleared the air with that.
I think so.
Okay, I mean, any other thing that you wanted to remind us of that you touched on last time?
Unless I know we got to the point of you had mentioned the issue of the parallels that we find in some pagan myths, actually possibly being based on copying from Christianity.
Right.
And you have a lot of Christian apologists that actually go that route to try to explain where some of these parallels come from. And I think that's a great tactic to take, because we do know that in the 2nd, 3rd centuries A.D., after the Gospels are completed, we know that all the Gospels are completed by the end of the 1st century.
Right.
That you start seeing, at least within the myths associated with what we call the mystery religions, a lot of parallels develop. So the argument is that these cults were trying to copy from Christianity, Christianity being, again, very aggressively spreading throughout the Mediterranean world, the Roman Empire, and being really a threat to the adherence to the old religion. And to sort of compete, a lot of the pagan cults start to model themselves after Christianity to somehow answer some of the same concerns Christianity is addressing, issues of salvation and things like that. And we know that that's pretty much the case, but what we got to be careful of doing is saying that all pagan myths, therefore, are just copying from Christianity.
Right,
If we
okay.
do that, I think we're making the same mistake that the biblical skeptics are saying, making when they say that Christianity copied from the pagan myths. And the big problem is that there are pagan myths that have parallels to the Gospels that predate Christianity. And I don't think we could just dismiss them.
Okay.
I think we need to deal with them.
Now let's talk about them now.
Okay. I'll bring up a couple, because again, there's so many that we could talk about. Let's do it this way. I'll just bring up briefly myth, say, of Dumuzi or Tammuz, myth of Osiris, and the myth of Dionysus. Those are three major myths that are usually brought up as a way to object to the Christian gospel, and all of them predate Christianity. The Dumuzi myth goes back to ancient Sumeria. Osiris goes back to at least Old Kingdom Egypt, if not earlier, and the Dionysus myth goes back probably even to the Bronze Age Aegean world. So they do predate Christianity. And the elements, like I said earlier, the virgin birth and the resurrection, are some of the things that some of the skeptics will try to find in these stories to say, look, these gods were born of virgins, these gods died and rose again, and that's where Christianity is coming from. The first thing I think we need to do is actually take the pagan myths side by side with the gospel and analyze the stories so that we can compare to see, well, how close are these stories?
Yeah, because what do we consider a parallel?
Well, the people making the argument that the Gospels are copies will sort of exaggerate the parallel to the idea
Right.
that these are almost the direct story.
Yeah.
It's the same exact story. I don't know if you're familiar with Zeitgeist or some of the films that have come out trying to purport this copycat theory. Zeitgeist was really popular at least a couple of years ago.
No,
I have a number of students that have seen it.
Explain it. I've never heard of it.
Not an expert on it. I've seen the film a couple times, but the part one of Zeitgeist really goes into the myths. They talk about the myth of Horus and Osiris and Mithra and all these different gods, and say, sort of point out that, all these gods were born of a virgin. All these gods died on the December 25th, or were born on December 25th and died and rose from the dead. And, they point out all these various parallels to the Gospels. And part of the problem is people making a lot of those claims are exaggerating the parallels. A lot of the claims are just not based in historical evidence that we have. I mean, you can go back and look at the film, and I encourage your audience to do the same, and then go to the sources and find out, well, where did they get this from? Because those are not in the original first primary sources for the myths. What I would accept as a parallel is something, doesn't have to be really close for it to be a parallel. And I'd say you have the issue of dying and rising gods that do show up historically, or actually in the stories historically from various cultures. And it doesn't have to be really close. For instance, let's go to the Dumuzi myth. Here you've got a god who is killed by demons, dragged to the underworld, spends half of the year in the underworld, comes back to the upper world for part of the year. Somebody takes his place, and it goes on in this cyclical fashion. Of course, I'm abridging the whole story for time's sake. But what you have is really a type of myth that is an agricultural myth, and a myth that's designed to explain the cycles of the seasons and the crops and fertility of the earth and things like that. And you find that in various cultures. The Greeks have the myth of Demeter and Persephone, which is very similar. Nothing of that sort do you find in the Gospels. You don't have this cyclical death and resurrection of
Right.
Jesus. You don't have him associated with the growing of the crops. There's a huge distinction that can be made there. With the god Osiris, his story that he's murdered by, his evil brother Seth, and he ends up sort of being revived by his wife Isis, the goddess of magic and resurrection and stuff like that. But again, when you look at the myth in detail, it's not that Osiris actually comes back to life. He never comes back to the upper world, to life the way that Jesus does after his death. What happens, some scholars have actually said he's not a dying god, but he's a dead god. When he dies, he goes to the underworld to take over as the ruler or the pharaoh of the dead. It's sort of a motif for the Egyptian belief in the afterlife, that he is the archetype that every Egyptian is going to follow after they go through the right burial process. So again, it's very different. When you get to the god Dionysus, who a lot of people say is this perfect comparison for Jesus, I think
What's the comparison that they make?
Well, the comparison again is that here's a god that is born of a virgin. Here he is, dies, comes back to life. The standard stuff. But when you look at the story again in detail, stories of his death and resurrection are greatly exaggerated. There's one particular story that's associated with the Orphic cult. It's a story of this baby known as Zagreus, who is the daughter of the child of Zeus and his daughter Persephone, who's born and is devoured by the Titans, which were this race of earlier gods, of the ancestors of the Olympian gods. And they just devour the child, rip him to shreds. The only thing that's saved is his heart, which is then ingested by Zeus, and he then impregnates a mortal woman named Semele, and she conceives Dionysus, and the story goes on from there. And what you end up with is not really a story of birth and death and resurrection, but really a story of reincarnation, which is what the Orphic cult believed in. If you're familiar with some of the early groups like that, they believed in the transmigration of the soul, and that's what that myth was designed to say. It's not a resurrection of any sort. And some of the things that really bother me is when I look at some of the scholars out there who are supposedly reputable scholars. One particular scholar wrote a textbook on classical mythology where he compares Jesus and Dionysus, and he goes into this lengthy thing on the virgin birth of Dionysus and actually brings up quotes from 5th century playwrights in ancient 5th century BC.
5th century?
5th century BC playwright Euripides in his play The Bacchae. When the quote he presents calls Dionysus the son of the Virgin, but when you go to the Greek source or any real good translation of the source into English, it doesn't say anything of the sort. So in his text, he's completely being dishonest in calling him virgin born because it doesn't say that in the Greek. It was unheard of. Okay. So again, this is exaggeration. This is really just...
Yeah, I mean, I heard about one who supposedly had 12 disciples, and I mean, just if you're just looking at it on face value, it's like, wow, it sounds almost exactly like it. 12 disciples, but I guess you've heard that story before, and I imagine that's
I can never
exexaggerated.
find the 12 disciples in any of these stories. I've looked.
Wow.
The closest that I've seen is in the worship of the god Mithras, and there's no issue of disciples. It's his association with the zodiac, the 12 signs of the zodiac, and this astronomical type of motif that goes in with his worship. But that's really the closest thing that I found. There's really nothing out there.
Yeah, I was having this dialogue with this atheist, and he was going through the whole litany of these things about and one of the things I tried to do was I asked him for quotes, quote a text that predates Christianity that has this information in it. And he just rant and raved, but he never produced any quote. I mean, he was like, "Oh, everyone knows this. You must be an idiot if you don't know this." Well, okay, just if it's that well known, just produce me a quote. I mean, and that's what I do when people make these charges. I say, okay, well, just show me the evidence, because people can say anything, and that's what people do. People, they read these things, and I see this a lot on the net, where you will see someone who make a charge, and then like everyone else would pick it up. But I don't see any substantiation of it. It's just something that's just thrown out there. Oh yeah, Christianity copied from this, that, and that, and this. But you don't see any documentation of it. It's just stated.
Yeah.
And you basically confirm what I suspected, is that the reason there is no documentation for it because it doesn't exist.
Yeah. What you have in the sources that we do have, like I said, we have early sources for a lot of these myths. But like I said, when you compare the stories side by side, we see that the parallels are drastically exaggerated. The best that we have is a general parallel. Okay, and I don't think you need to posit some kind of copying. You know, if it was if the story was
Right.
very close, then maybe you
Right.
could say, yeah, it seems like it was borrowed, but there's no need. Um, the next step I think we need to look at, let me bring up the issue of the virgin birth and the resurrection,
Yeah.
since those are like the two most common elements that people bring up. Um, Granted that the other stories that are existing are general parallels. The fact that the virgin birth and the resurrection are in the story of Jesus, I think, are necessary elements in the story of Jesus. And I'm going to say that if the story of Jesus is historical truth, or if the story of Jesus is fiction, of course I don't think it's fiction,
Right.
but either way, if the story was going to be written down or actually developed the way it did historically, those elements are necessary given the theology, Christian theology, given the mission of Christ, given what God is supposed to be accomplishing in the incarnation. The idea that you have this life of infinite value that is given as a ransom to redeem man from sin, to cover the sins of all the earth, and that after the redemption of man, you also have the conquest of death and the promise of eternal life. If you just think of it logically, the virgin birth is necessary because your options, I mean, for God to fulfill that mission for us, okay, to do what we can't do for ourselves, which is to save ourselves. Um, One option is, you know, the idea of a perfect man living and then dying for everybody. Well, if he's just a man, then his death isn't going to be sufficient to cover everybody's sin, right?
Right.
It needs to be a life of infinite value. So, well, what else could God do? He could manifest himself as a human being, in which case he looks like a human, he could live like a human, but he would never really be truly human, and he could never really die. So that's not an option. The other option would be for God to create Jesus from scratch to fulfill this mission. But if he creates Jesus, well, God can't create another God.
Right.
So you're going to
Right.
have, again, something that is insufficient to fulfill that particular mission. Or you get the idea that, well, you know, like in the pagan myths, a god will, you know, have some kind of sexual relationship with a mortal woman and conceive a child. But of course, in the Judeo-Christian concept, God's not physical. He can't do anything like that. That would be complete heresy. So that's not an option. The only option is for a mortal woman to conceive via the Holy Spirit, to give birth to somebody that is truly God and truly man, so that he could die to cover our sins, and that life would be of infinite value to do what it's designed to do. So I'd say the virgin birth is just necessary. I mean, you can't conceive of the story any other way. And the same thing with the resurrection. If God's mission is to redeem man, conquer death, and provide eternal life, well then, if Jesus lives, you know, as God on earth, he comes, he lives, and then he ascends. If he doesn't die, then there's no redemption. If he comes, he lives, he dies, and doesn't rise, then there's no conquest of death. If he comes, he lives, he dies, and rises spiritually, then there's no proof that, you know, he rose at all. The only option is that he lives, he dies, and rises physically, which is exactly what the Gospels say. So just logically speaking, I think those elements are necessary. They don't need to be borrowed from any other stories. There's no other option.
Right.
I think God's plan is the only plan that could work.
That's well said. I mean, well said. And not only that, but that explains the human condition and redemption of the human condition, whereas these other stories, none of that's addressed.
No,
none,
no.
none of that's even touched on.
Yeah, it wasn't even a big issue with a lot of those pagan cults. That type of salvation that Christianity's offering.
Right,
Yeah.
right. I was just thinking about another one of these parallels, supposed parallels that this atheist had brought up to me, and one was now I may mispronounce the name, so Ishtar, where we get Easter from.
Yep.
Supposedly that's a whole dying and resurrection thing because of the Easter means rebirth. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I know we talked about Easter a little bit last time. The idea that the word Easter is associated with the goddess Ishtar,
Yeah.
I think is a false derivation of the term. I think I mentioned last time that the word Easter you find in Anglo-Saxon religion, pagan religion, the goddess Easter. Ishtar was a Near Eastern goddess. She was based on the Sumerian goddess Inanna. She's basically a goddess of love and war and you know, sexuality. And there is a myth that's actually associated with the god Dumuzi, who I mentioned earlier, and the idea that this goddess Ishtar or Nana goes to the underworld and is trapped there, and for her to return to the upper world, Dumuzi, or Tammuz in the other version, ends up being dragged to take her place. So you do have that story, and that is one of the parallels that I think is one of the stronger parallels for what you find in the gospel. But again, it's a very different story,
Right.
and I don't think it's at all related to the Easter holiday. First of all, the Greek term for the holiday was never called Easter. It's called the Paschanastasimon, which is the feast of the resurrection. It was that's what it had been historically called. It was never named after any other pagan religion. It was a uniquely Christian holiday.
Right.
Closest relation is the Passover, which is where the time of year Jesus actually died, because he is the Passover sacrifice.
Right. So you were explaining before about the God who lived like part of the year, and it was sort of like, I noticed a lot of these things have to do with fertility and rebirth. So I guess is the idea that this was just man's way of trying to explain natural phenomena?
Some of it is, and I think where we get into the again how to understand myth. You've got different reasons people come up with stories, and some of them are to try to explain the world. Why do the seasons change? And they come up with a story like, well, there's this god that goes into the underworld, and it's a fertility god, and when he disappears, and everything dies. It's winter time, and when the fertility god returns, everything comes back to life. So, what we need to do to actually understand the general scope of things is actually now to go and look at other parallels, because like I said, there are parallels that predate Christianity, but there's also parallels that you find all over the world. You've got these dying god myths among the Aztec and among the Mayan, Australia, and Japan. A lot of these cultures that have no contact with the biblical world. And just the fact that these exist is one reason that we could say that borrowing is not necessary. Okay? Then we got to try to figure out, well, how do these stories come about? How do we explain these parallels? And in myth theory, I think one of the most revolutionary theories that came out in the early 20th century has to do with sort of a psychological understanding of where myths come from. Carl Jung, one of the early psychoanalysts, actually came up with, very influential in the field of mythological study, but came up with what he calls the archetypal theory, where he talks about what's called a collective unconscious that all men share. And the idea here, and I'm not necessarily saying his theory is the right theory, but I'm saying he has some ideas that I think will help Christians make sense of things, is the idea that myth is sort of a way that human beings we think in a certain way. That myth actually springs from certain structures of our thought process. Almost like myth is an epistemological tool. It's a way that we try to approach reality, a way that we try to understand things, a way that we try to come to knowledge of things. It's not coincidental that the Bible is written primarily in narrative form. Stories are something that people understand. There's something inherent in human beings that just connect with that type of narrative. Okay, and the idea with the theory is that we all think in a certain similar way. We have the certain similar images that come to mind as we tell stories independently. That's why people in ancient Mexico, and ancient Japan, and ancient Mesopotamia, and ancient Greece are all telling stories that have these parallels. They're general parallels, but they're there. And they seem to spring up independently. So there's got to be something other than borrowing in there. And I think it has to do with human nature. I think it has to do with the way we're designed to think. And I think even with Jung's idea of this collective unconscious, that we've got these ideas universally, it implies a universal human nature. And I think the best way to explain a universal human nature is from a theistic worldview. You've got to have theism as the basic framework for understanding all of this. So I think what we need to do as Christians is go back and deal with the issue of worldview. That's got to be the place we start. If we have the correct worldview, that's where we're going to be able to determine what is valid as a mythological theory, what we can understand to be historical versus what's unacceptable as historical data. It's really the foundation of all of our understanding. And I think there are great arguments for a theistic worldview. And you can go right back to what we call the theistic proofs. And I don't know if you've talked about this in other episodes. I don't have time to go into it. But you've got the classical proofs for the existence of God, the cosmological proof or the teleological proof or things like that.
Right, just for those who don't really understand those terms, but the cosmological is basically from the universe. We're looking at the universe and seeing the design of the universe. The theological is from design, just looking at life and looking at things that clearly are designed. And the last argument you probably want to mention is the moral argument, that if we all have common morals, then there must have been a common giver of that moral, and that common giver being God.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, just because, as I teach mythology every semester at the college, when we get into certain myths, that's one of the things that I always emphasize with my students, that from culture to culture, they're teaching a lot of the same moral values. I mean, it's just more evidence for
Wow.
that moral design. But like I said, once you have the framework, if theism is true, then obviously supernatural events can take place. And that's really the actual objection to the Gospels and to pagan myth. Not that they're parallels, but that they're supernatural. We can't believe them. But if supernatural activities can take place, then we can then go back to the historical data and see how that the Gospels can be historically accurate. And with all that data, then we can make our judgments between pagan myth and Christianity, see which one's true and which one's false.
Right, right.
And I don't know how much time we have left over.
Actually, we're about done.
Okay. Then let me just wrap up real quick by saying I think God designed man to think in this way, and I think he entered human history in the person of Jesus and lived a certain way because it's universally recognizable. The gospel is going to transcend culture because myths transcend culture.
Excellent note to end on. Thanks for being on the show. Alan DiDonato, topic, debunking the mythological roots of Christianity, the follow-up. And that will end this episode of Giving an Answer. Be sure to join me again next time. And until then, goodbye and God bless.
For the open lines in you.